chapter and a half of Revelation. We just went right through there, and but don't get too excited. We'll slow back down, and we'll slow down. And these few chapters here in Revelation are pretty simple to teach. To be honest with you, they're pretty simple to teach, in that they're pretty straightforward in how the Lord has given it to John, and John relayed it to us through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. As we push forward, though, and we get past these trumpet judgments into the next few chapters, we are going to have to slow down quite a bit because there's some things in there that are pretty difficult to understand without understanding the symbolism that John is using, but also very exciting in that we get to play Guess Who the Bible is talking about, because there's some very, very interesting things that are going on in the world today. And if you want to see what's going to happen in the later chapters of Revelation and how these things are going to set up, just turn on the news and watch the news and pay particular attention to certain nations that are coming together right now, and the number of those nations that are coming together. I believe there are 5 in this group, and there will be 10 here before too long. You mark my words. But we're not there yet. That's just, we're not there yet. What we're going to look at this evening, we're going to start the trumpet judgments. Last week we finished up the seal judgments, and that's a bit of a fib, because we are going to have to touch base on the 7th seal one more time in the beginning of chapter 8, just to see those seal judgments closing out. And what we're going to see this week, where we're going to start to look at another series of judgments that we're going to see. If you remember the 7 seal judgments, the first 4 was the apocalypse, and then we saw the saints asking for retribution against those that had martyred them. We saw all of these things line up. We saw a huge earthquake, and then we got to the 7th seal, and when the 7th seal is open, there's silence in heaven. We're going to talk about that silence in heaven, and what this silent period is in heaven. It is a transition from seal judgments to trumpet judgments. So it's going to be an official transition to these trumpet judgments. And the first trumpet, second trumpet, third trumpet, and fourth trumpet are what we're going to endeavor to get through this evening. We're going to talk at length about each one of these. And while we're going through these, you see if you can figure out the pattern of what God is doing with these first 4. We split this up not because these first 4 are in chapter 8. We split these up because these first 4 are much different than the last 3 trumpets. And just as I'll give you some hints along the way. The first trumpet, destruction of vegetation. The second trumpet, destruction of the seas. And then the third trumpet, destruction of fresh water. And the fourth, destruction of the sun, or at least partial destruction of the sun. So as we go, before we get to the end, see if you can figure out what is happening with these first 4 trumpet judgments and what God is targeting in particular. But first, we need to look at the silence in heaven. In Revelation chapter 8, we'll be going through the entirety of Revelation chapter 8 this evening. But in Revelation 8, verses 1 and 2, we see this. And when he had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of a half hour. And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. So we read those last 2 verses last week when we were finishing up. And we want to expound on this first 2 verses and the first few verses here in chapter 8 this evening, because the 7th seal is a transition from seal judgments to trumpet judgments. And you see that the silence marks the seriousness of the wrath of God that's getting ready to come. The 7 seal judgments were bad. But in heaven, there is a holy hush that comes over the entirety of heaven, because they know that the trumpet judgments are going to be that much worse. The seal judgments were terrible, but the trumpet judgments are even worse. And when you think of this, heaven is a place of worship and praise constantly. All throughout the beginning of Revelation, when we entered the throne room of God, from the time that John has been caught up in the Spirit, there has been something going on. There have been angels singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts." There have been saints. There have been 24 elders throwing their crowns down and praising the Lord. There have been saints under the altar of incense begging God and saying, "When will you avenge our deaths?" So heaven is a loud place. And even God himself, who sits on the throne, it talks about lightnings and thunders that are coming from the throne. So heaven is not a quiet place. Heaven is not like most churches today. You go in and you wouldn't know that there was anybody there but the pastor. I mean, people are praising the Lord. The angels are singing praises to God. So this is a deafening silence when for 30 minutes, nothing. Even the throne of God is silent. There is nothing in heaven. No sound. 30 minutes of silence for what's about ready to happen. So when the silence is broken, after the 30 minutes of silence in heaven, we see two different things that happen. We see two different things that happen. If you look with me in Revelation chapter 8, well, first off in verse 2, and I saw the seven angels which God, and to them were given seven trumpets. So there's 30 minutes of silence, and there's seven angels standing at the ready before the presence of God. And as that silence ends, each one is given a trumpet. Each one is given their task to do. And no doubt these angels know what they're about to do. They're about to blow these trumpets that signal these judgments on the earth. And no doubt that it's a burdensome job for a man to do. So only an angel could probably do this. I don't know any man that could blow one of these trumpets bringing this wrath that they know is going to come on the people that they know on the earth. So that's why angels are chosen for this, I believe. But the silence is broken by two things, and this officially marks the end of the seal judgments and the beginning of the trumpet judgments. Look with me in Revelation 8, verses 3 through 4. I don't believe I have these in your notes because it just took up way too much space. But if you look with me in verse 3, and another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, which came with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the seven angels which have the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. So this is the official end of the seal judgments, this transitional period. First off, we see prayers coming forth. Now, remember we talked about the altar of incense. And that's why I said that the martyrs were under the altar of incense. You didn't know I read ahead because it actually says it's the altar of incense here. And what the angel does is what the high priest would have done during temple times. He takes the ash from the altar and goes over to the altar of incense and dumps it on, and that's where you get the flame to burn the incense. So this is actually something that the high priest did over and over and over again during Levitical times. But you see these prayers that are going up, and we can imagine what they're praying for. We know what the saints have been praying for first and foremost. We know that the saints under the altar have been praying for vengeance and judgment, because we just saw that in chapter 7. But then, I can't also help but think that some of those prayers are from people praying for the salvation of those that are left on the earth. But we see this angel take this censer, which is, if you want to know what this looks like, just look to a Roman Catholic Mass when you get home. And it's a metal thing, and it dangles on a string, and they swing it back and forth. That's what this is. That's what this is. And it has this smoke and ash in it. So we see these prayers, and they're taken from the altar of incense, and the angel goes over, and he casts it to the earth. So fire from the altar is cast to the earth in Revelations 8, 5, and 6. When we just read that, the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. Now this is something different from what would have happened in biblical times, because those ashes would have been put on another altar. But here we see them cast into the earth. And what this does, this is a symbolic thing showing that the prayers of the saints have been answered. He's taking the prayer that was sent to God from the earth, and he's sending it back to the earth. God is showing, in a nutshell, that the prayers of the saints are being answered. That this judgment is coming. That this vengeance is coming. That what we are going to call the day of the Lord is at hand. And we'll talk about that later on in some later lessons. But the silence is broken by the prayers, and then those prayers, the symbolic prayers, is sent back to the earth, showing that the vengeance and the judgment of God. So first off, the silence is broken with the prayers. But then the second thing we see, lightnings and thunderings and voices. It says that in verse 5, it says, and there were voices and lightnings and an earthquake. So the very last portion of the seal judgment is lightnings and thunderings and voices and an earthquake. Now the thundering and lightning, that's warning of danger to come. That shows the power of God, but it's also a warning of things to come. But this isn't going to be like any lightning or thundering that they've ever heard on the earth, because there's also going to be voices in the thunder and in the lightning. And that's going to signal to people on the earth who's hearing this that this is God. That this is unlike anything that they have seen or experienced before. The earth has never experienced anything like this before. So men won't be able to chalk this humongous storm up to anything other than God, because they'll hear the voice of God in the thunder speaking to them. Now, what will God say? That's always what I want to know. What will the voice say? Will it say judgment? Will it say repent? Will it say make straight the way for the king? Because he's coming back. What will it say? We don't know, but we know that there will be voices. And then another huge earthquake to end the seven seal judgment. We have verses 5 and 6 in there, and the angel turned filled it with the altar. We just read that. But then it says that there was a huge earthquake. Now, we can only assume the size and scope of this earthquake. We saw an earthquake in the earlier seals, remember, and it shook the earth so much that the mountains moved, the islands moved. It changed the topography of the earth. Now, we can only assume that this will be as big. The Bible doesn't tell us. But we do know it's an earthquake that will be felt around the world. We do know that the storm will be seen around the world. We do know that everyone on the earth will experience in the thunderings and the earthquake. And that's how the seven seals transition seamlessly to the trumpets. The first trumpet is spoken of beginning in verse 7. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. So the very first trumpet, after the earthquake, after the seals are done, there are seven angels lined up before the throne of God. The first one steps up and blows his trumpet, and when he does, hell, fire mingled with blood. Now, I want you to notice as we go through these trumpet judgments, you'll think some of them sound familiar. You'll think, well, boy, that sounds an awful lot like what happened in Egypt, and it is. Because if you remember in Egypt, hell fell down from the sky, and it would burn up when it hit the ground. Remember that? All throughout the land of Egypt, and in Goshen they were fine. If you look in Exodus 9, 18 through 26, you'll see the Old Testament explanation of the hell that falls down. This will be very similar. Now, what's different is that hell was completely isolated to Egypt. This will be all around the world. A worldwide hail storm. And not only as the hail falls and then fire will come up, then it says it is mingled with blood. Now, what does blood represent? It represents a lot of things in the Bible. It represents retribution, or it represents obviously death. It represents the repentant blood of Jesus Christ that we take on ourselves. But the blood, the hellfire mingled with blood, all these things are. This is not anything other than supernatural. Remember, in the seal judgments, we saw the Antichrist rise up, we saw war, we saw famine. All those things have happened before. But a hailstorm that catches fire and blood mingled with it, that's never happened. That's God saying, this is God. But what is interesting in this trumpet judgment, the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. So the world will lose with the trumpet judgment 1/3 of all plant life on the earth. Now, I don't believe that this is figurative. I don't believe this is allegorical. This is what it is. There are some things in Revelations that will say it is like unto, or it resembled a. Those are figurative. But when it says point blank that a third part of all trees was burned up and all the green grass was burned up, that is God saying that He will destroy 1/3 of all plant life on the earth today. What happens as a result of this first trumpet? Of all plant life off of the earth today, what would happen? Well, a few things. It increases the strain of a world that's already in famine. Because you remember the seal judgments, one of the very first seals was famine. That famine is still going on. We haven't recovered from that yet. And so now you lose a third of everything. All things on the earth, including a third of all crops, will be burned up. So it puts a strain on a world already in famine. And then you have the decreased ability to breathe. Now, why in the world would we say that? Do you remember your elementary science? Remember that? My teacher called it photosynthesis. What do plants do? Give off oxygen. Plants, they breathe in the CO2 that we blow off. They take it in, and through sunlight and water and the miracle of God's creation, photosynthesis happens. And what do they breathe out? They exhale oxygen. So while we're exhaling poison to us, they suck it in through their leaves and they push out life-sustaining oxygen. What do you think would happen if 1/3 of all of the air filters in the world disappeared? And there is fire everywhere and smoke everywhere. Well, that's one of the things people don't think about with this first trumpet. Not only will it be harder to eat, it's going to be harder to breathe. And the entire atmosphere around us is going to start to change just a little bit. It's going to change even more here in just another trumpet or two. But the plants that filter off all that CO2, as they are destroyed, there is less oxygen to breathe and more CO2 in the air. People will become hypoxic. If you're asthmatic during the tribulation, you might as well just check out after this one, because I don't know that you'll be able to make it. And that's the truth. Because the oxygen level, the oxygen quality will be poorer. The second trumpet then sounds in Revelations 8:8-9. And the second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. And a third part of the ships were destroyed. So after the 1/3 of all plant life is destroyed, then it says that as it were a great mountain. Now remember, I just said that if it were a great mountain, it would say it was a great mountain. But what is the phraseology? As it were a great mountain. That's how you know the difference between a type and a figure in the book of Revelation and an actual thing. Had John said, and I saw a great mountain lifted and thrown down, and then it would have been a mountain that would have been picked up from the earth and dropped down. But it says, I saw as it were a great mountain. So we can infer that this is perhaps a meteor or asteroid or a celestial body. Remember, God does use natural things to do His bidding. He always has. If you look at Old Testament judgments from Noah's Ark to other things that have happened, you see God using natural elements. So we can infer that it was, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire. So it's probably a meteor or asteroid. But what happens is this: a third part of the sea becomes blood. Now that is not figurative. You see the difference? A third part of the sea becomes blood. Now some people who look at the Bible today, they would say, oh, this is red tide, because we see that phenomenon now. I do not believe it is red tide. I believe it is blood. I believe the Bible says what it says. And I believe that if it said it became as it were blood, then yes, maybe it could be red tide. But it says it became blood. So just as in Egypt, you remember in Egypt? Remember that the Nile turned to blood? Actual blood. Just like in Exodus 7:19-21, we will also see 1/3 of all salt water turn to blood. Now, God is signing these judgments. You notice that. Just like in Egypt, I did this. God. Just like in Egypt, I did this. God. He's putting His thumb stamp on it so people on the earth will know this is God. Because for years they've been saying, where's God at? Now He's showing them. If you show me God, I'll believe Him. Now He's showing them. as asteroids and meteors fall to the earth. And when they hit and they turn a third of the sea to blood, and a third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. One third of all ocean life will die. That's the algae, that's the whales, that's the shark, that's the crabs. That's one third of all sea life will die. Now that doesn't seem like too big a deal to us because we're land lovers here. We're landlocked. But if you go down to Myrtle Beach and you see how much food actually comes from the sea, that's a lot. One third of all ships will be destroyed. Now, why in the world would one third of all ships be destroyed? Because they can still run in blood, right? Yeah, they can, but you got to think if a huge asteroid hits the water, there's a huge tsunami, and one third of all the ships that are in the ocean will probably not make it. They'll capsize. I mean, it's just a practical effect. The cause of something hitting the water when an asteroid or meteor hits, there is a tsunami, and as it pushes out, it only makes sense that ships are at sea. One third of them will be destroyed. Now, why would God tell us that? We'll look at that here in just a second. The result of one third of the seas turning to blood is this: decreased food source. We're already in famine. We've already lost one third of all plant life during a famine, and now we're losing one third of all living creatures in the sea, and that adds to an already depleted food chain. People love to see food. I mean, I love seafood. I love to go to Calabash and eat till I puke. But one third of all sea life will die. So food sources will be even more scarce. Decreased transportation of goods. Why? Because one third of all the container ships in the world have been destroyed. If you don't think that it's a big deal that a container ship flips over, order a Christmas suit from Amazon for Christmas service and tell the people you got something great, and it never shows up. International commerce will be devastated if we lost one third of all ships in the sea right now. During COVID, one third of all ships on the sea were not in dry dock. We lost a few that weren't able to sail because the sailors were sick. And think of how hard it was to get anything. So just imagine international commerce or lack thereof if one third of all the ships in the sea were destroyed. What does that mean? Second trumpet, even more death. The third trumpet. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. God just loves throwing things to the earth from the heavens during these trumpet judgments. And a great star fell from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. So this is another celestial body falling to the earth. And I summarize and think, as other biblical scholars do much smarter than me, that perhaps it's a comet because it describes the burning of the tail. That's like a comet's tail has burning. But also, I surmise that this is probably a comet because unlike any other thing that falls to the earth, men name comets. Halley's Comet, remember that? We wait for it. I don't know when it's coming back, but they'll name comets. I feel that this might be a comet as well because it's named by the scientific community. It's named by people. These other bodies that have fallen so far have not been named. So whether it's a comet or an asteroid or a meteor or God's fingernail, we don't know. But I believe it's probably a comet. If you remember not too long ago, there was a comet that came dangerously close to the earth, remember? And they kept talking about it, and it was like, 150 billion miles away, and they acted like it was a close call. Well, celestially, that is a pretty close call. And there are, interestingly enough, comets that scientists surmise now that could run into the earth. Some as early as 10 years from now. So this great star falls from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. So this third judgment, we see wormwood hit the ground. It can also be assumed that wormwood breaks up as it comes into the atmosphere and is scattered, landing in rivers and streams all around the world. Why do we say that? Because it says that there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers. It fell upon the third part of the rivers. If it's one single solitary chunk, it's going to be hard to hit one third of all the rivers with one big rock. because that's just not how math works. So we can assume by the description that John gives that this thing breaks up and it lands. And how would God have it land? Into 1/3 of all fresh water bodies. The water will become bitter, means it becomes poisonous. Wormwood, in fact, is a poison. It's something that exists today. And wormwood is something that's derived from a plant root, and it's poisonous. It can make you almost intoxicated like you're drunk. It can make you deathly ill. So that's why we see the name wormwood. What's the result of 1/3 of all fresh water becoming poisonous? Now remember, the seas are salt water. We can't drink that. But fresh waters, rivers and streams that John mentions by name, that's fresh water. That's what we drink. 1/3 of all fresh water becomes poisonous. Death to people due to direct poisoning from drinking the water and also from dehydration. Because if we lost 1/3 of all fresh water in the world today, we would not have enough water to go around. And you also got to think that water cycle, photosynthesis, and the water cycle that goes with it. Think back to elementary school science. 1/3 of all the plants are gone, which is filtering. And then 1/3 of all the fresh water is gone, not including what we've destroyed ourselves over the years, polluting the planet. So what's going to be falling from the sky? Probably poisonous rainwater, just like acid rain, just more wormwood. So due to the decreased infrastructure of transporting clean water, those in need of clean water will not be able to get clean water. So you'll die of thirst, which is a terrible way to die. Or you'll get thirsty enough to drink the wormwood and you'll die then. Wildlife will also die because they're not smart enough to know there's a boil water advisory. And as a result of animals dying from wormwood, more food shortages. You see, it's going to be a terrible, terrible place to live. The earth. All the worst parts of all the worst science fiction movies you ever saw will pale in comparison to the truth and the reality of the trumpet judgments. And the fourth angel sounded, and a third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars. So as a third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. Revelations 8:12. The fourth trumpet, when the fourth angel sounds his trumpet, God will supernaturally reduce the celestial body's light and energy by 1/3. Boom. Well, that's not too bad, 1/3. Well, if I turn it down by 1/3 of a degree in here, people riot. Crucify the pastor. It's 1/3 degree cooler or 1/3 degree hotter. I mean, seriously, think of the comfort level we enjoy because of the sun's heat. So God himself, it said that it'll be smitten. So this isn't something falling from the sky. This is God turning out the lights. He'll smite it. The sun energy will be decreased, thus decreasing the intensity of the moon's brightness. The moon only reflects what the sun gives it, so it's by default. If the sun is 1/3 less bright, then the moon will be 1/3 less bright. And the stars will also lose 1/3 of their brightness. Everything will be, the dimmer switch will be on. Why does this matter? The loss of solar heat will cause a radical drop in temperature, producing severe changes in meteorological, botanical, and biological cycles. You wake up and go to sleep because your internal clock is set to the sun. You wake up and go to sleep. People that work night shift for years, their life expectancy goes down. You know why? Because they're doing something that's not natural. You're supposed to be awake when the sun's up. That's the way it works. That's the way your body's in tune. That's your circadian rhythm or circadian rhythm. So when we lose 1/3 of the heat from the sun, it's going to be unimaginable, the impact. Now, I was joking about the thermostat, but when we have our beautiful poinsettias in here, Miss Pam Nybert's like, make sure the heat is this amount. And I make sure by penalty of death, because I don't want people to come in and be dead poinsettias on Christmas morning. And it's really no different. But if it's a 10-degree drop, we have dead flowers. But if it's a 10 degrees rise, it's too hot. How much more do you think we are in tune to the sun and heat? Crops will fail and more food shortages. Already depleted, and now They don't have the sun they need for photosynthesis. Colder regions of the earth will become uninhabitable. You think 1/3 colder than Florida, that's not too bad. You think 1/3 colder than Michigan, that's pretty cold. You think 1/3 colder than our friends to the north in Canada, they won't be able to survive. People will freeze to death in their beds. Older folks that have survived this long, older folks will die. Younger folks will die. Babies will die. People will die. And there is nothing that anyone can do about it. Why? Because it is God that is doing it. No one will stay the hand of his judgment. So the first 4 trumpets have sounded. Divine destruction of the earth's ecology. I should have asked you. You're supposed to be paying attention. Did you notice the theme to the judgments? It's the ecology of the earth. Divine destruction of the earth's ecology. Vegetation, salt water, fresh water, and sunlight. Do you know what makes the planet Earth inhabitable? Water, our distance from the sun, presence of salt water. Most of our planet is made up of water. You look at that map back there, most of it's water. Most of our bodies are made up of water. And God is going to destroy 1/3 of all types of water in the first 4 judgments. No wonder it got quiet in heaven. This is the very foundation of what makes the earth livable. God is making the earth uninhabitable 1/3 at a time. 1/3 of the things that makes it okay to live here, he's taking away. 1 trumpet at a time. The 4 trumpet judgments, these are just the middle of the judgment cycle. There are bold judgments to come. We've gone through 7 seals, which have led us through the first 4 trumpets. But I want you to notice that the last 3 trumpets are different from these. Where God has judged directly the habitable earth, the habitation that he has given us, God gave us this planet, and now he's taking it during the time of the Great Tribulation. He is taking it back 1/3 at a time from us, and it's his to take. But the last 3 trumpets are demonic devastation on the earth's inhabitants. These aren't going to be ecological things that happen these next 3 judgments. These next 3 trumpets, completely different. Demonic devastation on the earth's inhabitants. We're going to look at next week, starting chapter 9, what are known as the 3 woes of Revelation. And they are amazingly terrible. We will see people beg to die and God not allow them. Before they're dying in the droves, God's not going to let them die. He's going to keep them alive. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. Next week we'll start to look at these next 3 trumpets and the 3 woes of Revelation. And we will understand exactly why the angel screams this at the top of his lungs. So imagine now we're in the throne room of heaven. John has seen these things. And there are 7 angels. 4 have blown their trumpet. Now they stand idly by at attention, waiting for the next 3. God himself knows what these judgments will be. I don't know and don't believe that anyone else, any of those angels, know exactly. This is God's plan. We're privy to it. But I don't know that these angels blowing the trumpets know. But could you imagine being in heaven and having that knowledge and seeing this on the earth and knowing, oh, I never asked her about Jesus. Oh, I never talked to them about how to be saved. Oh, I should have. And you watch them die of thirst or die of starvation or freeze to death in their bed because it's so cold. And what will you think that you're thinking then when it's your friends and your family and your neighbors that are dying? Will you remember all the times you had the chance that you didn't say a thing? Will you think back to all the opportunities you had when you were talking at that fence? Everybody has that fence neighbor, don't they? I had a fence neighbor. I used to have a few fence neighbors. You stand at the fence and you talk like Tim the Toolman Taylor, you know. And you'll think about all the times that fence neighbor gave you an opening to say something about salvation, and you just didn't do it because you didn't want to lose that fence. And how will you feel when you watch him die of thirst or freeze to death or go and drink water that's poisonous knowing it just because he's so thirsty? That's just assuming he makes it to the trumpet judgments. He may have died in the great earthquake and the seal judgments. When we talk about 1/3 of things happening, you'll notice that there's a pattern to God's design, and we'll see this numeric thing happening all throughout. We'll address it and we'll talk more about it after we get through these judgments. We're going to close in prayer.